Welcome to the AT Parenting Survival Podcast, where you get help and guidance through the chaos of parenting a child with anxiety or OCD. This show is for educational purposes and is not intended to replace the guidance of a qualified professional. Here's your host, child therapist, Natasha Daniels.
Well, hello there, and welcome to another episode of the AT Parenting Survival Podcast. Today is actually a special podcast because I'm actually recording the video of this as well. We're going to try doing a little bit of video with the podcast, and we'll see how it goes. I'm used to just being able to record this over and over again. So we'll see. Today, I want to talk to you about understanding the core fear in your child's anxiety or OCD and why it matters, because it does matter. And the reason why I thought to do this episode is because I just got done with my free series. I record these way ahead of time. It's November 20th, but this isn't coming out until I think New Year's Eve. So happy New Year's Eve. So not for a while. I'm very ahead of the game, which is awesome. But I just finished my free series, Survival Tools, and I got quite a few questions about, do we really need to know the core fear? Why is the core fear important? I mean, does it really make a difference in how we're going to approach our kids' anxiety or OCD anyway? And it does make a difference. It is really important. If you don't know it, you can still get by. But I wanted to talk today about why it is so important and going through how we use that core fear to give our child's struggles some momentum so that they can crush their anxiety or OCD. All right, before we get started, I do want to thank NoCD for sponsoring this episode. NoCD offers affordable, effective, convenient therapy, and they're available in the US and outside the US. And you can schedule a free 15-minute consultation to see if NoCD is a right fit for you and your child. Just go to treatmyocd.com. That is treatmyocd.com. I'll leave a link in the show notes, and it's also in the description. Okay, so let's jump into this today. I want to first talk about why a core fear is important, regardless of the fact that we are going to treat anxiety or OCD the same way, regardless of theme. So anxiety is treated differently than OCD. I have done episodes on that. With anxiety, we are going to process cognitive distortions. We are going to reframe anxious thoughts. We're going to tackle, problem solve, rationalize, explore, process anxious feelings. And we're not going to do any of that with OCD, because OCD laughs at that and says, "Oh, you want to rationalize with me? Bring it on. Or are you going to problem solve? I got a lot of problems to solve. I'll tell you exactly what rules to follow, and we'll problem solve it together." OCD is chess. Anxiety is checkers. Both games are not fun, but you can't play by the same rules when we're talking about anxiety or OCD. But this episode is not about that, so I'm not going to dive too deep. I do already have an episode on that. But the important thing to realize is no matter what anxiety theme, we are going to do that. We're going to reframe cognitive distortions. We're going to create challenges where you're walking towards the things that you're anxious about. We are going to reframe those cognitive. I already said that. I'm distracted by doing video, staring at myself. This might be too distracting. And with OCD, we're going to do a type of cognitive behavioral therapy called ERP, exposure response prevention. And we are going to do some psychoeducation on what OCD is and how it shows up and how it's bossy and how it wants you to scratch that itch and how it puts you on a hamster wheel. We're going to talk all about that. But we're not going to rationalize your way out of those thoughts. We're not going to problem solve your way out of those thoughts. There's no bird poop on the handle. Let's talk about it. We're not going to do that, because the person typically who's struggling with OCD already knows that it's irrational, or already knows that that issue isn't real, but it doesn't make it any more scary or uncomfortable. So we're going to do exposures. We're going to systematically expose them. So just a brief snapshot, just in case you're like, wait, what is the difference and why does even that matter? That does matter a lot. Why the core fear is important. So we are going to use the same framework and structure regardless, but it's important for a whole bunch of reasons, and I've listed them in my little note taking. The first one is it can feel overwhelming when you feel like your child, young adult, or even yourself, right, has all of these different themes. You might have, you know, OCD, and you might have sensory motor OCD and moral OCD and harm OCD and just right OCD and symmetry OCD. And you might be like, why do I have, I don't know why I get I get fuzzy sometimes with this camera. Sorry, so distracting. But you might be like, why do I have all of these themes? They seem unrelated. I conquer one theme and then another pops up and it's whack-a-mole and it can feel really hopeless. You might have hundreds of compulsions you have to do. You might also have generalized anxiety. You might have other health things, not health, you might have health anxiety, but you might have other anxiety themes. And so it might be overwhelming because you're like, I have all of these different issues, and it can feel like a very heavy plate. When you understand that there are maybe one, two, or three core fears driving all of that, that can reduce a little bit of overwhelm and concern for whack-a-mole. Because I know there's so many parents that I've worked with who are like, and kids too, where they feel hopeless because they're like, we tackle one theme only for another one to pop up. So what is the point? It just changes flavors. Well, most of the time, a lot of the time, it's still being fueled by one of those core fears. Core fears don't radically change over time. Most people have one to three, and it ranges. This is not, this is not science that they have one to three core fears, but typically, anecdotally, I have seen people having one to three core fears, no more than that, really. And those are driving all of their anxiety and OCD. And so that can really help when you're like, okay, I have this one fear. It's showing up in this way, in this flavor. And then next week it could show up in this flavor, or this, when I'm this age, it shows up this way. And now I'm this age and it shows up that way. That can help a lot. The second reason why it can be really helpful is that you can spot an issue so much quicker when you know already that there is a core fear. Let me give you some concrete examples because I always feel like concrete examples definitely help. With my son, this is just a really good example because it did take me a while to figure out his core fear. It seemed like he was just randomly anxious about various things. This is an anxiety theme. And so he was, when he was a kid, and he's still kind of a kid, he's a teenager, but he was afraid of cacti. We live in the desert. There's a lot of cacti out here. He didn't want to get poked. But like to the point where if we were in the parking lot, he would walk all the way around because he would see a cactus standing like in the corner of the parking lot. So a very extreme degree. He was really worried about bees, scorpions, to the point where it was hard for him to go outside, right? So these are really extreme. He was afraid that someone's going to poke his belly button, and so he would hold his shirt down all the time. He was afraid that someone was going to stab his neck when he was going to sleep, so he'd keep a blanket all the way up to his neck. All right, so I'm telling you them in order, so it might seem really obvious what his core fear was. Also, he was really, really afraid of shots. That was we had to kind of like bear hug him and calm him down, so that he was calm enough to get a shot. So very extreme as well. Over time, I would say and we're going to get into how you find the core fear in a minute, but I would say things like, what's the scariest part about getting a shot? What's the scariest part about a bee? What's the scariest part about X, Y, and Z? What would happen if you didn't keep your blanket over your neck? What would happen if you didn't hold your shirt down? And I discovered over a long period of time that the answer to every single one of those fears was, I don't want to be poked. Poking hurts. I don't want to get poked. I don't want the cacti to poke me. I don't want the needle to poke me. I don't want the bee to poke me. I don't want the scorpion to poke me. It was a fear of pain. And actually, that's his core fear. because he's older now, is pain. He is very, very concerned about pain. And so that kind of dictates a lot of his themes currently around that. So that's just one example that it really helped me put things into perspective. When you know that your child has moral OCD and that their core fear is, I'm afraid of being a bad person, when they start to ask you about the rules of the house, or they start to ask you for permission to, can I go take a shower? Mom, can I go have a snack? Mom, can I open up the refrigerator? And it's new behavior. And you know that the core fear is, I'm afraid of being a bad person. And part of that is breaking the rules. And even being a bad person is not the core fear, right? We can go deeper. The core fear is probably, well, with moral OCD, the core fear is different for each kid. Sometimes it's a fear of not going to heaven, but they're going to go to hell. It's a fear of disappointing God, which often kind of leads back to not going to heaven. It's a fear of, if not religious, it can be a fear of other people abandoning them and them being fully alone, full rejection. A core fear could be that they're going to go to jail or they're going to get detention or some sort of punitive action. So core fears, even with moral OCD, are different for each person. That's why it's so important to really explore these individually with our kids, because when I was doing this series just recently, people would list different things. They'd say stuff like, I'm just giving you an example. They might say something like, well, my child, wants their handwriting perfect and they want their hair perfect and they get upset when their shoes aren't tied good enough. What's their core fear? And then somebody else chimed in that series and said, oh, it's because they feel like they're not good enough and they're not perfect. Well, we can't assume that. That's an assumption. Never assume, right? That person just listed superficially just some compulsions, right? Obsessing about getting their hair perfect or their shoelaces tied perfect. It could be a core fear of just right, because sometimes a core fear is a core feeling, and the feeling of it not being just right or the feeling of it feeling disgusting. The core fear is that I won't be able to handle the discomfort around this feeling. And so disgust and just right OCD often get missed because people are looking for a fear and they forget that just right OCD and disgust is not fear-based. It's not, I'm worried that the worst thing will happen or I'm worried that something bad's going to happen. It's, I'm worried that I won't be able to handle the discomfort of this feeling. That's still a fear, but the fear is around the feeling. And so we can't assume just because someone is wanting their hair perfect or wanting their laces tied up just right, that it is that they don't feel just enough. We'd have to ask them. I wouldn't be able to assume anything until I spoke to a kid and said, and that's kind of what we do in the AT parenting community. People will say, what's my child's core fear of this? And I'm like, go ask them this, this, and this, and come back to me and we'll talk more, right? We need to get data directly from the child because we can't assume that we know what the core fear is. And so understanding the bigger picture, and if I understood that my child had a core fear of pain or a core fear of disappointing God, then I would pick up on some new themes a lot quicker. So be like, oh, this is one of their themes, or this is a red flag for their theme because they've had this issue before. The other thing is, if you don't know the core fear, you could be setting up exposures or anxiety challenges that are completely missing the mark. And I will give you an example of this. We're going to still talk about anxiety, but then I'll give you an example of OCD. So my daughter, from a very young age, was very, very fearful of various things. So when she got her blood pressure taken at the doctor, and she has celiac disease, so she would go to the doctor a lot, especially during the diagnosis year, she would get into like a full-blown anxiety attack because of the blood pressure. She didn't like the blood pressure cup. When she would get her blood taken, she would get into such an anxiety fit that she would throw up. And there was a period of time when she had this episode where she was learning about blood in the, she was taking a science class. I think this was during COVID, maybe not. I think it was during COVID. She was taking, because I think she was at home and she was doing work at home. And they were learning, she saw some sort of diagram or something about the veins and the blood. And I think it was just a cartoon drawing of it. And for that day, she couldn't have anyone touch her. She was afraid that we were going to slow her blood or stop her blood. And so we jumped right on that. I was like, we're not having that. Like, it was like nobody could touch her. She couldn't touch anyone. It went from 0 to 60 in one day. And for 24 hours, we worked on it nonstop because she was willing and able. And we pulled that weed before it even had time to grow roots. That's the beautiful thing about learning how to spot anxiety or OCD, is that you can spot it a mile away when you learn how to do it. And then you pull that weed if you have a child that's willing and able. And so when I look at those three things, they seem unrelated to me. And in fact, I didn't think they were connected for a long time until she got older and started to get more articulate. And I would say, what's the scariest part about a blood pressure cup? Well, I don't like it. It squeezes my arm and it hurts really bad. And I think it's going to cut off my blood. What's the scariest thing about getting your blood taken? Now, I had assumed, this is a good example of assumptions. I had assumed that it was the poke, because I was dealing with my son who was terrified of getting his blood taken, terrified of shots. And it was because of the poke, which is most people, right? So it doesn't seem like too much of a leap to assume that it is because they're afraid of the poke. And with my son, we actually did poking exposures where I opened up like a paper clip and then I would lightly poke him. That sounds completely bizarre. I totally get it, but it worked. And he was able, now he can get shots, no problem. He can get blood work, no problem. He was really able to kind of desensitize himself. It did help. That wasn't working with her. Why? Because that wasn't her problem. So I said, what's the scariest part of getting your blood taken? It's the rubber band that they put around my arms. I'm afraid it's going to stop my blood and it really hurts. Okay, well, you put that together with also her OCD issue around not being able to be touched for like that day because she was so worried that we were going to stop the blood flow. Her core fear around all of that was having that pain of something around her body, and ultimately the fear that her blood was going to stop. And so then we were able to target the feeling around her arm and do exposures around that. And that really helped. She still struggles sometimes, but at least we know what her core fear is and we can target that core fear, right? Like we could even practice. I actually bought a blood pressure cup, disposable one, and we were able to practice that. And so learning what things we're targeting is really helpful. If I was focusing on the poking, it would have fallen flat because I wasn't targeting the right thing. Let's use an example like contamination OCD. So with contamination OCD, I've worked with people who have the same exact overt symptoms, right? Let's say we have, and I use this example in the free series, and I use this example a lot because it's just the most simplistic. But let's say we had 3 people with contamination OCD, and none of them wanted to touch a doorknob. I might just assume that they all have a core fear of germs because obviously they don't want to touch a doorknob. They must be afraid of the germs. And so I might be doing exposures of getting them to touch the doorknob and then eat some food, or touch the doorknob and then touch their other stuff. That may or may not work because I didn't get to the core fear. So I might be doing an exposure that's not working because I'm not tackling the core fear. For the first part, we'll just do an example. Maybe the first person, their core fear is, if you say, what's the worst part about touching a doorknob? And they say, it's disgusting. It's gross. And that is their ultimate core fear. A lot of people have a core fear around disgust. They might be afraid there's bodily fluid on there. I have seen that one be really common. Or there might be boogers, or germs are just gross and disgusting. And so, me touching it and then necessarily touching other things or eating something that may or may not move the dial for me because it's about disgust. The second person, let's say they are afraid that if they touch it and then they touch their mouth, they're going to get sick. So it's more of the classic contamination OCD that people kind of recognize. And let's say the third person is, I'm afraid that I'm spreading my germs. And so my core fear is I'm going to get my loved ones sick. If I touch doorknobs and my family touches doorknobs, they get sick and they die, that'll be my fault and I can't handle the responsibility. So my core fear might be harming other people and them either not liking me or me harming them and they die and it's my fault. And so that might be my ultimate core fear. So you can see where we're going to do exposures that are going to be completely different depending on what their core fear is. For the person who's afraid of their family members, well, I'm not going to have them touch the doorknob and then maybe like eat a piece of food from their hand because that won't do anything. I might have them touch the doorknob and then I might have them get some food and hand it to their parent and have their parent eat it. That's going to be more stressful for them. For the person who has germ issues and they're worried they're going to get sick or die, them handing food to their loved one and feeding their loved one isn't going to move the dial because that's not their core fear. They could do that all day long probably because they have to feed themselves. That's the scary part for them. The person with disgust OCD may or may not get disgusted if they have to feed somebody else, or even if they have to feed themselves. It might just be a feeling that they don't like. It may still actually gross them out, so that might be effective, but every person is different. You'd have to explore that. So understanding the core fear really does help you develop better exposures and better challenges, because if you're not targeting the right core fear, you can miss the dial. And I'll go more into that after the break. So on the podcast, we do take a break. On YouTube, we will not, but we'll stay tuned. We'll be right back.
It's time we put help directly in our kids' hands. Introducing Crushing OCD course for kids and teens.
It was way more helpful than all the other therapy we've ever done because we didn't really know what to do. So we weren't really doing it before. So the course helped to figure out what the exposures are and how to do them.
We're not in therapy and find it really hard to find an ERP trained therapist here. So we're currently with like the public health service, but again, they don't seem to be trained in ERP. It's filled that gap that we don't have that was desperately needed.
This was really well timed for us to use between therapists and to help us get off to a good start with this new practice.
It was easy to use. I was able to do it from my phone or also on the computer.
There's different ages, so there were younger kids, there were teenagers, and so that was really nice too, to have a variety of ages where it wasn't just geared towards younger kids or older kids. It was a nice variety.
It's helpful for our kids to hear it from this third party as opposed to just us saying it.
I really like the offense and defense method. I love working on poking at OCD while it's sleeping. It makes it a little bit easier to do, and it's kind of fun. I'm planning on using it to work on my fear of holding or touching batteries and stuff like that.
So it was really helpful, and I think a lot of other kids would like it. I thought that I was the only one who had worrying about the weather and stuff. And then there was somebody else on there who worried about the same thing, which was really helpful.
Seems less scary to work on stuff now that I've watched this class, and I'm more interested to work on it.
I like trying to do more exposures still, and before I wasn't, I just didn't want to do them.
I've worked on some of my bigger compulsions and been successful.
I realized that it was helpful to do the exposures. Before it was really, really hard. It's still hard, but it's helpful to know that I need to do them.
Before there would be a lot of battles about it, so it is definitely less loggerheads.
Really, really good course and super helpful.
Definitely would recommend this. It's really easy to follow. It's nice bite-sized videos. I really like the worksheets that go along with it, and I think it's really helpful.
To learn more about this course and register your child or teen, go to atparentingsurvivalschool.com.
Welcome back. Okay, so before the break, we're talking about why core fears are important, what they look like, how they kind of dictate exposures and all that kind of stuff. So when you understand the core fear, not only are you going to reduce overwhelm and thinking that you have so much stuff going on, be able to spot new themes quicker because you understand the core fear, craft more effective challenges and exposures because you know exactly what you're trying to target. You can also sprinkle in the core fear when you're doing exposures. And so let's use social anxiety as an example. Everybody with social anxiety has a different core fear. Most people with social anxiety, probably everybody with social anxiety, does have the fear of rejection, criticism, and feeling that they're not enough. But the area where they don't feel like they're not enough is different for each person. And what triggers their social anxiety and that fear of judgment is different for each person. And it's so interesting to me because my daughter and I both have social anxiety, and yet we are such vastly different people. I'm an introvert, she's an extrovert. My biggest trigger with social anxiety would be for me to sit alone in a crowded event. So if you said go to a conference and then sit by yourself, that would be like a 10 for me. Or go to a party, even worse because it's not structured. Go to a party and then just sit in the middle of the party by yourself. That'd be like a 20. That's actually still very, very high on my hierarchy. For her, that wouldn't be a big deal at all. She'd be like, okay, like why is that a problem? That's not her trigger. That's not her core fear. For me, the fear of judgment of being alone and rejected, or the perceived rejection of like, she's a loser, she's sitting by herself. There's Natasha, she has nobody. That is one of my core fears, like the judgment of people finding out that I'm really a loser. It's kind of sad. That's not her core fear. Her core fear is losing control in front of other people, in particular friends, not so much strangers. And so throwing up in front of her friends, having an anxiety attack in front of her friends, having like an accident, sensory motor OCD with her bladder, that's a core fear. I might pee in front of my friends. All about losing control. That's not mine. If I felt really sick and I threw up in public, or my kids threw up in public, which has happened and is actually legitimately embarrassing, that's not a good exposure for me because that's not my core fear. At that point, I'm like, like, come on, give me a break. Like, I've got bigger things to worry about. So we would be very different in what our exposures would be or what our challenges would be. For me, it'd be sitting alone at a party. That would be really hard. For her, it would be losing control in some way in front of her friends. She's going to a dance. She went to a Hawaiian dance. It was Hawaiian themed. People were wearing Hawaiian shirts. And she was like, Mom, I need to get a costume. I'm like, a costume? Why? She's like, because I need to get a banana costume. And I was like, well, it's not a dress up dance, is it? She goes, no, but I want to be a banana. And I was like, my social anxiety was like, oh my gosh, I think it's a really bad idea because you're going to be like made fun of and, maybe you won't be able to handle that. My social anxiety was like, no, because my core fear would be like, that's mortifying. I'd rather be alone, and have that judgment. But that doesn't trigger her social anxiety. She's going to another dance. So that was last year. I just have to tell you this really funny story. So this year, the theme is meet you at midnight. And I keep asking her, what does that mean? Meet you at midnight. She goes, Mom, it's just a New Year's Eve themed party. And I'm like, I don't know. Maybe that means something more. She goes, it doesn't mean anything. It just means like it's a New Year's Eve themed party. I'm like, okay. And so I said, so should we prepare? Like, do you want to go out and get a dress for this? And she goes, no, but I do need to order what I'm going to wear. She goes, I'm dressing up as a star. And I go, oh, is it like a Hollywood themed star dance where you're going to like dress up as different stars? Because then I'm like, maybe that's a movie title. I kind of get it now. She's like, no, like I literally want to be a star. Like, you're going to dress up as a star? Yeah, we need to look for a costume. I'm like, well, people might make fun of you. Oh, I don't care. I want to be a star. She's hysterical, right? Mortifying to me, hysterical. But that's not her core fear, right? So just embarrassing her in public as an exposure, which I don't really recommend doing anyway, that's not going to move the dial. For her, it's a loss of control. She is in full control when she's a star. And I'm sure she'll be a beautiful, amazing star. So understanding how you're going to sprinkle in and craft exposures that address the core fear is really important. When we are doing, let's say we're doing a contamination OCD exposure, you can sprinkle in the core fear when you're doing exposures. And so let's say I'm having a person who has harm OCD touch a doorknob or touch something, or even just use their hands. That's sometimes enough. And then they're like giving their parent something with their hand, like a piece of food. And let's say that isn't, that's where we would start. Maybe we just start with that. And then like, let's say that's not really moving the dial. They're not uncomfortable with that. It's not causing anxiety and they're a little bit lower. We would add another layer to that exposure, weaving in their core fear. And so then their core fear is related to them harming their loved one. And so then we might role play and they might say, oh, here's a piece of food. I'm pretty sure I'm sick and I've got germs on my hand, but you can have it anyway. You may or may not get sick. We'd weave in something that is kind of underlying. I I've had people who have harm OCD and they have to say a certain thing at night to make sure that their loved one doesn't pass away. Like, I love you too, be safe. And we'll do exposures once we know that the core fear is around them being responsible. It would be like, don't be safe, because now we're going to target what OCD is trying to tell them to do because we understand the core fear underneath it. You can do imaginal scripts. I have a whole podcast on imaginal scripts. I have a YouTube video on imaginal scripts as well, where you add a layer where you're doing a story on top of actually doing a physical exposure. And when you do that, you're addressing the core fear, and understanding the core fear is really important. So you would sprinkle those on top. So sometimes you just do exposures that aren't really hitting the core fear, but then as you get more advanced, you can start to role play and tackle those core fears. I'll try to give you another example. I've done with moral OCD, where the core fear is I'm going to disappoint my mom and she's not going to love me anymore, which I know that's really sad. You can't rationalize that with OCD. You can't be like, I love you, I love you, I love you, and no matter what, I love you, and I'll just tell you I love you every day. OCD doesn't care. And so it's counterintuitive, but the way that you're going to tackle that with exposures would be to role play the thing that OCD is tormenting the child about, which is your parent is going to reject you. And so you can do it kind of in a funny way, but if you know the core fear is the parent's going to reject you, then you might role play where the child says something like, Mom, I did something really horrible. I did this. And then the parent's like, oh my gosh, I can't believe you did that. And I normally have the child write the script because they know exactly what OCD is telling them. So we're getting to the core fear, though, of the parent is rejecting them. And it becomes silly. We can do it with accents. We can make it a game. It doesn't have to be a serious thing, but we're tackling the core fear of my parent's going to reject me. And we're teaching the child that they can sit with the discomfort of that actually happening through their role play without them doing a compulsion. So hopefully that helps kind of flesh out a little bit of how you would weave in the core fear and sprinkle it into some exposures when you can. So then how do you find a core fear? That is the million-dollar question. It can be hard if your child is not willing or able to even talk about anxiety or OCD. So then you have to go back to building up trust and communication. And I do have a podcast on trust and communication. You can find all of my podcasts if you go to atparentingsurvival.com and then just go to the search button. So if you're on a phone, just go to like that little hamburger icon and go to search and just type in these titles. Or if you're on my website, you scroll all the way to the bottom and then there's a search button. You can find anything I've done that way. It's the easiest way to do that. But understanding how to find the core fear, you have to have a willing participant. So if you don't, then you pay attention to patterns, you pay attention to themes. For a while, I was writing down like the new themes that were popping up with my kids. And I had like a little note on my phone. I still do actually, just haven't written in it for a while, where I will, they'll have a new theme, they'll have a new intrusive thought, or they'll have a new compulsion, and I'll just write it down. And it's interesting because I won't see a pattern, as I'm writing them. But then when I come back and I zoom out and it's been like maybe 6 months, 8 months, or a year, and I look at the list at this point, like 5 years, 6 years, I look at the list and I see a full pattern. It's like really apparent. It's like, oh, all these things are about getting poked, or, oh, all these things are about her losing control. And so it becomes really obvious. So even if your child isn't open or communicative, you can at least start to play detective, watch for patterns and track them, create a notes or an Excel spreadsheet and just, keep the themes documented. That can be really helpful. Asking questions, if they're willing to answer them, is super helpful. And so asking them, what's the scariest part of? What's the hardest part of? So I thought to end this episode, I would role play a little bit of what that would look like. So I'm going to do one for anxiety and one for OCD. So let's say we had a kid who's afraid to go to bed. It's a super common one, like sleep issues. Anxiety and OCD love to impact sleep. I actually do have a whole course on that, how to handle sleep struggles caused by anxiety and OCD in my online school at atparentingsurvivalschool.com. So let's say that, and that's what I teach in that course. The first thing I do is let's get to the core fear, We have to understand what's driving it. People just assume we're going to throw like skills at you, but what skills we throw at you are going to be really different depending on what the core fear is as far as why you can't sleep. And so we can't make assumptions. And so you have to go on a deep dive around that. So let's say we had a kid who was like, I'm afraid to go to bed. And I would say, okay, what's the scariest thing about going to sleep? Well, I don't like being alone at night. All right. And I try not to be like, you know, just shooting questions at them. It's really helpful to validate it and say, I totally get that. Um, it could probably feel scary to be alone at night. What's the scariest part about being alone? Well, you're not there. So you see how they're just giving you answers that you have to keep on going, right? I know I'm not there. I'm in my bedroom. What's the scariest thing about me not being there? And if you've personified anxiety or OCD, that really helps too, because you could say, what does Mr. Worry, or you can even personify anxiety by saying, what does anxiety tell you will happen if I'm not there? And what is really helpful about saying that, like, what does anxiety tell you versus what do you think will happen if I'm not there, is inadvertently kids hear an accusatory type of thing where, what do you think will happen if I'm not there? Like, honestly, seriously. That's not how we mean it most of the time, but that's how it could be perceived. So when we say, what does anxiety make you feel? Or what does anxiety make you think will happen if I'm not there? That helps a lot because it removes them from the anxious thought or them from the OCD thought. What does OCD say will happen if this happens? So let's go back with the role play. So if I say, what does anxiety say will happen if I'm not there? And then the child might say, well, if you're not there, if a bad guy comes in and he creeps into my room, you won't be there to protect me. Ah, okay. So now we're getting to the core fear. The core fear is starting to look like they don't feel safe unless you're with them. And so they can't go to sleep because you're not with them. And if you're not with them, they're not safe. And if they're not safe, something bad's going to happen to them. So now I can really target, how do I empower them to feel safe in their own room and to not feel like I'm the one protecting them? Because we inadvertently do things like, I'll check on you, right? Don't worry, I'll keep checking on you. Well, that's kind of inadvertently reinforcing that notion of you're not safe unless I protect you. But we're not going to do that today. That's a whole nother topic. But you get my point, right? Now I know what I'm going to focus on. Sometimes you can say, what's the hardest part? And sometimes you want to start with the hardest part because sometimes it's not scary, right? What's the hardest part about going to sleep? I just want to do one more really briefly. They might say, let me think of a different one. They might say, my brain just won't stop. Okay. Tell me a little bit more about that. What kind of things is your brain telling you when you're trying to go to sleep? It's telling me that I have a test tomorrow. It's telling me that I said something stupid yesterday. It's telling me that I have this project due in January and I'm not ready yet. It's telling me blah, 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 right? All these anxious thoughts. And so what's the hardest part about that? I can't go to bed. I can't focus because I start to get really worried. Like, what if I didn't do that assignment? Or what if I fail that? Or what if right? So now I know, okay, their sleep issue, their primary thing around going to sleep has more to do with their overwhelm, like their fear of failure. And we could even go further and say, well, what happens if you don't do well on that project? Or what happens if you don't get that test in? Or what happens if you don't? Well, then I might fail. And what happens if you fail? Right? We can go all the way down the rabbit hole. But I know at night, if I'm targeting night and sleep time, they're ruminating. And so telling them that they're safe in their house is missing the mark because they hadn't really thought of that. That's not what they're ruminating about. They're ruminating about all the things they have to do academically. So asking the right questions and getting the right answers is really helpful. Let's do an OCD one before we wrap up. Let's say I have a child who is just randomly starting to not want to touch things. And so they have a cup and all of a sudden now they can't touch their water bottle and they want me to fill up their water bottle because they can't touch it. That could be literally anything. The core fear could be anything. Even the OCD theme could be anything. We can't assume it is whatever we want to assume because we haven't explored it. So I would say, let's just say we've personified OCD. And we'll just use OCD, but if you've named OCD, it's much, much better. And if I say, what does OCD say will happen if you touch the cup? They might say, it's dirty, and I can't handle that. Okay. What does OCD say makes the cup dirty? Well, I take my water bottle to school with me. All right. And a lot of times kids don't give you a lot. They give you like these one word answers. So you have to keep on pulling at the string. Sometimes you have to recognize that the conversation's over. They want to end it and you have to pick it back up. So I'm making it sound very simple, but this might be like a 2-week conversation because you get one little answer and then you have to let it go. And then you get one more little answer and you have to let it go. You have to remember where you were. Okay, we were at the point where it was at school. Now he doesn't want to talk about it anymore, so I have to circle back when he's ready, which might be in 3 days, it might be in 3 weeks. I don't know. So then I might say, circle back and say, what's the grossest part about, what does OCD say is gross at school? And then they might, and I'm just making this up, but these are real life examples based on like a composite of people in my community and in like the 2 decades of therapy. These are common answers I'm giving you that just are like a little snapshot of something that I've heard a million times. And they might say, in math, I sit next to this gross kid. Okay. What does OCD say is the grossest part about him? Oh, he's nasty. He picks his nose and he smells and he doesn't look like he's showered. He's so gross. And so he might be ground zero for this contamination issue. And so anything at school is gross because it's near this kid, anything that's touched him. So I'd still continue. I'd be like, how does the water bottle, is everything that comes from school gross because of him? Or is it gross for other reasons? Or is not everything gross? And they might say, well, the water bottle is gross because he moved it. It was on my desk and he touched it. And so now it's gross. And so I put it in my backpack and I washed my hands, but now my backpack is gross and my water bottle is gross. And so I can't touch either one of those. And so if you can put my water in the water bottle, then that's fine. And then my backpack, I just wash my hands at the end of the day and I shower and I feel better. I'm just making this stuff up. But what we're learning is, okay, he's using the word gross over and over and over again. And when we say, what's the worst part about being gross, or what does OCD say will happen if it's gross? And normally you get a response like, duh, it's just gross. It's nasty. And that's the end. You're at the bottom of the rabbit hole. Then I know, okay, the core fear around this water bottle, and maybe probably a lot of other things, is disgust OCD, and just the feeling of not being able to handle the emotions of disgust. And so I'm going to be targeting disgust. So that is how to find the core fear in a nutshell. I do have actually a workshop. I did a live workshop on how to find the core fear. And I do have the recording available as a workshop in my online school. So if you want a little bit of a deeper dive on how to find the core fear, or you want to go over it more in depth, you can check that out at natashadaniels.com/core fear. And you can get that workshop, that replay of that workshop. But I hope that this was helpful. I hope that you were able to kind of understand and flesh out the idea of why core fears are helpful. We don't want to get stuck on them, but they are, to me, an integral part of the process of crushing anxiety or OCD. It's like a data point that's really, really important and helpful. Sometimes we don't get the core fear for a while, and we can still function and do the things that we need to do foundationally to crush anxiety or OCD. But when you know that core fear, it just supercharges the whole thing. So I hope that you are enjoying my podcast. If you are, don't forget to hit a star and rate it. I greatly appreciate that. Let me know your comments if you're watching this on YouTube, now that we're going to be doing it on both platforms. Let me know in the comments if you have questions or any ahas while you are watching this. And I'll be back on Tuesday. Don't forget to find the sparkle in everything you do. Take care.
Thank you for listening to the AT Parenting Survival Podcast. To get additional support raising a child with anxiety or OCD, visit Natasha's online school of on-demand classes at atparentingsurvivalschool.com.